In this video, we're going to be talking about the workbook objects you can interact with in Excel's VBA. And there are a few different ways that we can reference workbooks in the code. The first method is to use the workbook number. This is mainly applicable when you have multiple workbooks open and you want to run your code across all of them, or if you want to get the names of all of the open workbooks. It isn't as accurate as calling the workbook out by its specific name, but it is a good way to address situations where you may not initially know all of the workbook names. The second method is to reference the workbook by its name directly, which is the most common method you'll use in VBA, so this is the main one that you're going to want to pay attention to. You can also use this workbook or active workbook. This workbook will reference the workbook that your macro code lives in, which can be a good way to toggle back and forth if you're using your macro-enabled workbook as a central dashboard file. Active workbook simply refers to the active workbook, so if you just want to be sure that whatever code follows will be definitely run on the active workbook, this would be a good option. Again, 9 times out of 10, you're going to use the workbook name method. And there's a lot of different things that you can do with workbooks. You can see the actions you can perform on workbooks by going to the full object library and highlighting the workbooks class or looking it up on Microsoft's help site, but I've outlined some of the key actions you might use here. And this list will pretty much cover everything that you'll be doing with workbooks in VBA. So first we can activate a particular workbook. So this is helpful for bouncing between several different open workbooks to perform actions. If you have a lot of workbooks open, you can use count to find out exactly how many of the workbook objects VBA can identify. You can also protect or unprotect your workbooks directly from VBA, including applying a password to them, which can be very helpful. We can also do general actions like adding a new workbook, saving it, opening it, closing it. So there's lots of different things that we can do with workbooks from Visual Basic. Now, objects also have properties assigned to them, and those are properties that we can read from VBA and we can use them in our code. So for workbooks, for example, we might be interested in the workbook's file name or in the file path of the particular workbook that we have open. We might want to check things like if the workbook is read-only. So again, we can find all of those properties on Microsoft's help site, but typically you're only ever going to use the name or file path related properties. So now we can go ahead and open up VBA and put some of this into practice. So I'm going to go ahead and go over to my developer tab up here. I'll click on Visual Basic to open up my Visual Basic window. And we can see I've already inserted a module. I've inserted a whole bunch of code here for us to walk through, so I'll give you a second to pause the video if you want to type out this code and follow along. Otherwise, as I go through this, I'll talk through what all of these inputs are and what they mean in terms of VBA. So I'll give you a second to pause. And that should have been enough time to pause and copy the code over if you want to. Otherwise, we can just follow along line by line. So all I've done here is I've created a public sub called test codes that I can run this from anywhere in my workbook. And now I've used the first method of referencing a workbook, which is referencing it by the number. And again, this is a little bit risky if we're trying to reference it by number. If we have multiple workbooks open at the same time, this could cause a problem for us. We can also note that we've talked about following the object hierarchy before. And we can see here I haven't typed application. So it's a little bit risky if I were to open access or something in the middle of this code, but right now I'm going to let VBA assume that I'm working in the Excel application. So I've typed workbooks 1, which is going to reference this example workbook since it's the only workbook that I have open right now. And then I've typed .protect. So again, this little period right here tells VBA, this is my object. I'm moving further into my hierarchy right now, so I'm about to tell you what I want to do with this object, and I want to protect it. Now when we use the protect action on a workbook, you can see these are the inputs. You have a password input, a structure input, and a Windows input. The password is just what password you want to use to protect or unprotect the file. So I've just used the word password here, and we can see we've surrounded it in quotes because it's a string of text. So this denotes to VBA that password is a string of text. It's not an action or anything I'm trying to do. And then the structure and Windows inputs are both true or false inputs, and it just tells the system whether or not we want to protect the structure of the file and the windows of the file. And 9 times out of 10, you'll probably use true for both of those. So this line, all in all, should password protect this file that we have open right now, this example file. The next line saves the example file that we have open, and we can see I've used the same reference to workbook 1. This third line is going to be a little bit trickier. So I'm going to save this workbook that I have open, this example workbook. We can see I've referenced it by name now instead of by number. And I'm going to save this as a new file. So it's important to note that when we save things as a new file, it's important that we include the file path all the way out to the file name. So in this case, the file name is going to be new example, and everything that comes before that is the file path. And the easiest way to get the file path is to just open up wherever folder you want to keep this information in, right-click on the folder up at the top of the screen, and click Copy Address as Text. And when we come back in here, we can paste that address and see it show up as text. You'll notice the only difference between this and this is that we've had to add this extra backslash into the code to designate that we've entered the example folder here, and now we're naming the file. So file name, when we deal with VBA, is often referring to the full file path and the file name. So here I have my full file path and my file name, and this is being given to the file name input. The next thing we have is the file format input, and we can see this bit of code here, this XL, open, XML, workbook, macro enabled. It's a really long string of code, and this represents something in VBA. In this case, it represents the code that our save as action needs to save this file as a workbook that is macro enabled, which is a little bit different than a workbook that's just a general workbook that doesn't have any code in it. And so you can find this full list of file formatting codes on Microsoft's website or in the object library. But the key ones that you'll usually use are macro-enabled and default workbook, which I'll show you later. Now we can see there's a couple different password inputs down here, and I've left both of those blank, but we'll talk through them. So password would be if you're just password protecting your file, so the user won't be able to access the file at all unless they know the password. Write-res password will let the user access the file as a read-only file if they don't know the password, but you'll have to know the password to get into the file and make any edits. And then this input that I've given as true is for read-only recommended. And what that means is that when the user opens the file, VBA is going to recommend, or Excel is going to recommend, that they open the file as a read-only file. And the user can choose not to do that. They can choose to go into the file and edit the file instead. And if they do so, it'll let them into the file without entering a password at all. So there's a bunch of other inputs we can do here. We can create a backup file. We can change things about the way that the file is going to look or behave. But usually you're only going to use these front couple of inputs here. So all in all, this line should save this example file as a new workbook called new example. It should be macro enabled, and it should recommend to us that we open as read-only. So we move into this next set of lines here. So all these lines that represent here are, I've created an integer variable C, and I've told the system, for C, I just want you to count all of the workbooks that I have open right now. And we suspect that this should probably be 1, because I should only have my example workbook open when I run this code. We'll show this in a message box later, so we'll go ahead and move on. So I mentioned before that it can be a bit tedious to keep typing out the object hierarchy all the time. So typing out application, .workbooks, parentheses, example, and then dot and whatever we want to do with that workbook. So instead, one kind of shortcut we can take to dodge having to type all of that out every time is to create a workbook variable. So this line here creates a variable, I've called it WB1, as a workbook. And so a workbook is a specific type of variable that we can use that will essentially represent everything up until this period here. So everything that comes before this. And we can save that as, or input that variable however we want to input that variable. So in this case, I want to set this variable equal to my new example workbook, which is what I will have just saved this as. So it's important to note that with workbook variables or worksheet variables, any type of object variable that you're creating, you don't just type WB1 equals and then whatever you want to set it equal to. You use the set command here. Set WB1 equal to workbooks new example. So that's going to be anytime you use objects or that sort of thing, you're going to want to use set instead of just the equal command.